Ok, ok. Acho que já estamos. Bem, então...
E a mim tem que me atribuir permissões, senão não consigo gravar também.
E onde é que é isso?
É no meu nome, em mais.
Bem, mas já
Consegue?
estamos a... Não estou a ver agora, mas também já estamos a
Já está a
avançar.
gravar. Já está a gravar
Ok.
neste momento.
Bem, então, pedindo desculpa por este pequeno, enfim, sobressalto inicial, eu queria dar-vos as boas-vindas a todos e a todas, enfim, à terceira edição da Cátedra OIT, que é uma cátedra que nós realizamos aqui na Faculdade de Economia em articulação com os Centros de Estudos Sociais e com a OIT desde 2018. Eu queria fazer este pequeno enquadramento inicial em língua portuguesa, até porque nós tivemos aqui um espaço de enquadramento inicial com os nossos oradores, os nossos convidados, e até já lhes fui explicando, digamos assim, qual era o contexto em que estas iniciativas tinham lugar, mas obviamente depois os seminários irão decorrer em língua inglesa. Queria, no fundo, aqui em primeiro lugar, dizer-vos que esta iniciativa da Cátedra resulta de uma simulação que fizemos em 2016, 2017, da chamada Conferência Internacional do Trabalho. A Conferência Internacional do Trabalho é um órgão da OIT que reúne anualmente e que tem uma estrutura tripartida e que, na verdade, acolhe representantes de governos, de empregadores e de trabalhadores. E nós fizemos aqui nesse ano letivo, em 2016-2017, uma simulação que reuniu mais de 300 estudantes da Universidade de Coimbra, dos vários cursos da Universidade, dos vários ciclos de estudos. Estudantes de licenciatura, mas sobretudo também de mestrado e de doutoramento. Alguns estão aqui presentes, a quem eu também saúdo particularmente. Essa iniciativa foi, digamos assim, um rastilho daquilo que viria a ser, a partir de 2017, um protocolo que celebramos com a OIT, no sentido de, no fundo, celebramos a Universidade de Coimbra e a OIT, no sentido de reforçar esses laços entre uma comunidade académica, uma universidade secular e uma instituição também que tinha acabado de fazer, ou que estava prestes a fazer, os seus 100 anos. Portanto, como sabem, a OIT fez também 100 anos em 2019. E, portanto, maximizando esta experiência anterior e reforçando outro tipo de protocolos que já haviam sido celebrados no quadro da Universidade de Coimbra em 2010, com o Centro de Estudos Sociais, foi celebrado esse protocolo de cooperação a que chamamos a Cátedra OIT. A Cátedra OIT teve e tem tido, desde essa altura, teve 2 edições, e nessas 2 edições, permitam-me apenas recordar o que é que nós discutimos. Em 2018, foram discutidos temas relacionados com a história da OIT e com os chamados Green Jobs. Foi discutido também, houve seminários também sobre padrões internacionais de trabalho, economia digital e desigualdades sociais em alguns países pertencentes ao G20 e o caso da Europa do Sul. Em 2018 foi isto que discutimos. Em 2019 tivemos a oportunidade de discutir aqui o Wage Report sobre o Gender Pay Gap, foi um dos temas, assim como a questão do trabalho decente e o multilateralismo, foi outra das intervenções que tivemos, e também tivemos 2 intervenções, 2 seminários sobre economia de plataformas e sobre o direito à desconexão. Portanto, estes foram os temas que discutimos anteriormente, e este ano, vamos ver, daqui a pouco o meu colega da OIT fará uma breve referência a isso. Vamos ter aqui 2 temas que são complementares dos temas que já discutimos nos anos anteriores. Eu, portanto, queria congratular-me com isto, em nome da direção da Faculdade de Economia e também, enquanto membro de investigador do Centro de Estudos Sociais, queria congratular-me com esta parceria e com o facto de podermos, no fundo, dinamizar não só a comunidade académica, como valorizar também a importância crucial que a OIT tem neste panorama internacional, enquanto representante dos interesses do mundo do trabalho. Queria também dizer-vos que, portanto, depois desta, eu já vou passar a palavra ao Dr. Fernando Sousa Júnior, que é o representante da OIT, mas queria dizer-vos que depois, no final destas apresentações, as apresentações vão durar cerca de meia hora, sensivelmente cada uma, e na sequência dessas apresentações teremos um espaço de debate. E nós aguardamos que possa ser usado e que possam ser colocadas questões, de preferência por escrito, no chat, dirigidas ao meu colega Fernando Sousa Júnior, que vai acolher essas respostas, essas perguntas. Se as perguntas forem formuladas em português, elas poderão ser traduzidas por nós e depois levadas aos oradores para lhes poderem responder. Portanto, basicamente é isto que eu vos queria dizer neste contexto inicial. O que estou a dizer-vos agora em português, já o disse antes em inglês aos oradores, para eles perceberem qual era o contexto da minha intervenção. Portanto, dispenso-me nesta fase de fazer a tradução face àquilo que acabou de ser dito. Portanto, passaria a palavra ao meu colega Fernando da OIT, Sousa Júnior, a quem cumprimento, como cumprimento, obviamente, também a colega Joana e, obviamente, a diretora do escritório da OIT de Lisboa, a doutora Mafalda Troncho, que não está aqui presente, mas que tem estado desde a primeira hora, digamos que como representante desta iniciativa. Muito obrigado, Fernando. Então, a palavra é tua.
Obrigado, professor Hermes Costa. Eu pegava, se calhar, nessa última nota. De facto, a nossa diretora de escritório da OIT Lisboa, a doutora Mafalda Troncho, por motivos profissionais não pode estar presente, mas, em todo o caso, em nome dela e do escritório, saúdo todos e todas que nos assistem. Este ano, neste formato à distância, que está tão em voga nos dias que correm. Gostava também de agradecer à Faculdade de Economia da Universidade de Coimbra pelo acolhimento que desde o primeiro momento demonstrou a esta iniciativa. Queria ainda salientar que este evento é o fruto dessa parceria que há pouco foi referida. Que esta parceria foi estabelecida já há alguns anos entre o escritório da OIT e a Universidade de Coimbra, mas que, em particular, com a Faculdade de Economia e com o Centro de Estudos Sociais da Universidade, tem de facto tido muito dinamismo. Gostava ainda de sublinhar que que é sempre com um enorme prazer que participamos, que a OIT Lisboa se associa a estas sessões da Cátedra OIT, mas aqui cabe salientar, por elementar justiça, tenho que destacar o empenho que ao longo destas 3 edições da Cátedra OIT tem sido colocado pelo professor Hermes Costa, que tem sido uma peça absolutamente crucial em todo este processo e por isso cabem aqui os agradecimentos do nosso escritório. De facto, a cátedra que se encontra agora na 3ª edição é a prova de que há ideias que começam pequenas e resilientes, vão fazendo o seu caminho, mesmo que em situações difíceis como as que estamos a enfrentar presentemente. E de facto, como foi há pouco referido pelo professor Hermes, foram já vários os temas abordados, mas este ano os 2 temas escolhidos parecem-nos da maior atualidade. Por um lado, as desigualdades no mundo do trabalho e, por outro, a economia do cuidado. E, portanto, atendendo a essa atualidade, pareceu-nos muito bem associar-nos uma vez mais a este evento. Assim, sem grandes delongas, se calhar eu passaria a palavra àqueles que são os especialistas destas áreas e, portanto, hi Patrick, hi Umberto.
Hello, Fernando. Hello, Hermes.
Let me introduce you to the audience. O Patrick Belser é um perito da OIT, é economista sénior desta organização, na qual é especialista em salários. É coordenador de uma equipa que dá apoio a diversos países no âmbito do salário mínimo. Ele está igualmente envolvido na publicação do relatório global sobre salários da OIT, que é publicado em cada biênio desde 2008. o nosso colega Patrick Belser trabalhou anteriormente com temas como o trabalho forçado e o tráfico humano. Ele é doutorado em Economia pelo Institute of Development Studies da Universidade de Sussex, no Reino Unido. Graduou-se em Estudos Internacionais em Genebra e pela Universidade de Columbia em Nova Iorque. Portanto, posso acrescentar que tem publicados vários artigos e capítulos de livros sobre salários, trabalhos forçados e tráfico humano. After this introduction, we can start with your presentation. So please, Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and apologies that I need to switch to English. I did not understand everything you said, but my native language is French. And so I think between French and Portuguese, there is some similarity. So I think I understood about 2/3 of what you say, and it sounded very good to me. Thank you very much for this introduction. So I don't think I need to introduce myself after that because you did it very comprehensively. And I will do a presentation. I'm trying to present between 20 and 30 minutes. And it would be nice if you participants could mute themselves, I think, because there's some voices. And the subject of the presentation is going to be inequalities and the world of work. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Does it work? Yes, it works. Okay. So as you said, Fernando, the issue of inequalities has been studied and explored in some details in various of the global wage reports, which we are producing in the team here. So the last wage report was on the issue of gender pay gaps. And my colleague Katarina presented this report in Coimbra last year. And I thank her very much for that. But even the previous wage reports looked at some aspects of inequalities. We had this green wage report. The previous one looked at the inequalities within and between enterprises, which has become a very much more researched topic in latest years. We've seen that there is a lot of inequality between enterprises, but also within there is a polarization of the of inequality, basically of wages and salaries. And we have also explored in some empirical detail the linkage between wages and income inequality. And as I will explain later, this is an important distinction between what is wages and what are household incomes. And when we talk about inequality, inequality between whom and inequality of what. And so some of what I will present is also included in a report which will be presented to the International Labour Conference in 2021. This report is ready, and so some of what I'm going to say is included in this report, but it's not been shared yet because the International Labour Conference has been postponed this year because of the dramatic COVID crisis. So this discussion is going to be a very important institutional discussion for the ILO, how to strengthen the ILO's response to inequalities. And this leads me to a few preliminary considerations. First of all, we're talking about here of inequality within countries. So inequality between countries is very important. We also have done some research on this. You know, we know that the richest country in the world has a GDP per capita, which is about 190 times the GDP per capita of the poorest country. We've also calculated that the richest 20 countries have on average a GDP per capita, which is 48 times the average of the poorest 20 countries. So with the amount of inequality between countries is huge. But here the focus is on inequality within countries. And the fact that there is inequalities between countries should not distract us from the fact that inequality has also increased in many countries, and that we have to look into possible policy priorities and responses to these trends. And much of what the ILO does in terms of promoting social justice is also very important to reduce inequality within countries, of course. And here's where the whole policy discussions and social dialogue that the ILO is promoting has most potential to address inequalities.
Ok, não percebi. Esse cabo era USB, não era?
Desculpa?
Esse cabo é USB. Também não lembrava.
Would you mind muting, maybe, Hermes? Can you just remind people?
USB.
É possível desligarem os microfones, quem não estiver a falar? Agradecíamos. Obrigado.
Obrigado. And so the second point I wanted to make is that we're talking about inequalities in the plural. So inequalities in the plural because it has many manifestations, it has many dimensions. And you know, some differentiation that we do is between the vertical inequalities, between the top and bottom within a particular country. But also, and on the other hand, horizontal inequalities, which are inequalities between groups, between categories of people, between categories of workers. It includes inequalities between men and women, between rural and urban areas, and between young and not so young people. And we have a lot of discussion here which suggests that these inequalities, these horizontal inequalities, are becoming more and more important in terms of the perception of people and in terms of the expectation of people to be treated fairly. And so there is even an argument that these horizontal inequalities now matter more than the vertical inequalities. Still, my presentation will focus heavily on vertical inequalities, and Umberto will address some of these more, some of horizontal inequalities in some more detail and the intersectionality between them as well. Why do we focus on the world of work? This is because we are the ILO for a start. So the ILO is all about the world of work, but you know, there is more to it than that. It's because basically labor markets are essential, are fundamental in understanding and reducing many forms of inequalities. We know that inequality starts before people enter the labor market. You know, they start at birth, they start depending on where they're born, what type of families they're born, what type of backgrounds. But it's in the labor market that people earn their income. And for most people, the main source of income is labor income. So how the labor market functions is absolutely crucial in determining inequality outcomes. And this is sometimes a little bit neglected in the debate on inequality, which focuses a lot on subjects like education or redistribution, which are very important. But one of the key messages of my presentation is let's not forget about how important labor markets are in producing inequality outcomes. And then maybe, you know, one question we ask sometimes is, well, is this really important? Why should we care? And of course, on one level, we care because fairness is important. You know, horizontal inequalities are about fairness between people, the idea that we're all equal at birth and we should be treated in a fair way, but also because there's more and more research which shows that high inequalities have negative effects on social, economic, and political areas. And I think the social we knew, the economic aspects has been documented more and more, including by organizations like the IMF, which did not traditionally care so much about inequality. And the political consequences, I think we're all seeing them, right? We're seeing social unrest in Chile, which have to do with inequality. We're seeing the election of the president in the US, which has, you know, part of it has to do with inequality between rural and urban areas. big cities and peripheral places. And so I think we are all waking up to the importance of this. Okay, these are long introductory remarks, but these are important, and I will accelerate a bit on the other aspects of the presentation now. Fernando, if you can remind me at some stage when I reach 20 minutes, because I don't see time here, and although I'm Swiss, I have no watch. I really apologize for this. So just raise a red flag when it's 20 minutes.
Okay, I will.
Thank you. So just some facts and figures, I think some of which I find are particularly striking. Okay. So what are we talking about here? I think this is a preliminary consideration. It's very important when you look at inequality measures and figures and discussions. Some studies document the evolution of inequality of primary income. Primary income at the household level is the income that comes from jobs, work, and that comes from property. And so for many people, labor income is the most important part of this primary income. It includes, wages we get, but it also includes the self-employment labor income. And we've also seen that for maybe, a small percentage of the population, property income has become more and more important. These are dividends, interests, rents from owning land and real estate, and we've had an explosion of capital incomes at the top, which is also reflected in the decline in the labor income share of GDP at the national level in many countries. But so this is primary income, and of course, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but I'm just saying this so we contextualize the figures I'm going to show you. The other discussion is about disposable. The broader measure is about disposable income, which includes transfers that you receive from the states and which comes from the taxation that can be more or less progressive and which has the potential to redistribute income. So when we look at the primary distribution before taxes and transfers, one estimate of the World Inequality Report is that since 1980, the top 10% of households captured half of economic growth in Europe and 2/3 of all economic growth in the US. So when you really pause and you think about these numbers, you realize how enormous they are. It means that 2/3 of all the economic growth has gone into the pockets of 10% of people in the US. And there is increasing literature on this. In the latest Journal of Economic Perspectives, if you follow this, you'll see a series of interesting articles, which basically say, look, no wonder that people increasingly don't recognize their situations in macroeconomic figures. When we say there's been economic growth of 2%, most people don't see this in their pockets. And so this is also what inequality is doing to basically to the adequacy of some of these macro figures that we read in the press and we see all the time. After taxes and transfers, inequality has increased too. In OECD countries, disposable income of the 10% are now 10 times higher than the bottom 10%, up from 7 times in the 1980s. So even after tax and transfers, inequality is at record level in the OECD. And if you look at wealth is the accumulated income over time, is what you have on your bank account and what you own and the real estate. The richest 10% control half of all of it in the OECD, and the bottom 4% have almost no savings, no wealth at all. So these are important. This is considerable, enormous inequalities which we observe. Of course, there are some important differences across countries, and you'll be able to see in the PowerPoint when you receive it later. I'm not going into details here, but typically the inequality tends to be lower in some Northern European countries and higher in some Southern European countries and also in the UK. And the US remains the country with the highest inequality among advanced OECD countries. Now there are also horizontal inequalities. The ILO Global Wage Report, which was presented last year, estimated that women earn on average 25% less than men on a monthly basis and 16% less on an hourly basis. These important differences that remain, which cannot be explained only by differences in levels of education. There are other important gaps here. I think in the US, we've all been watching the election, I think. The income of Black households is 36% lower than the income of white households. There's still considerable gaps which have an enormous influence on the politics of countries. And as I said before, some of these things happen, some of these inequalities take course outside of the labor market, but the labor market itself creates inequalities. There is discrimination in the labor market against certain categories of people in contradiction to the principle of equal pay for work of equal value, which the ILO promotes. And I think this is where the ILO also has a very strong agenda and a very strong mandate to promote a reduction of some of these inequalities. In many developing countries, I have to say that inequalities remain even much higher than in European countries. If you look at South Africa and you look at the map on Africa here, you see that the southern part of Africa is where inequality ratios and Gini coefficients are the highest. South Africa is a place where the ILO has a lot of interaction and a lot of programs. I've been working in South Africa on the issue of minimum wages because it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. And even though apartheid ended quite a long time ago now, you still have the bottom 40% of the population getting only 7% of total income. So it's very, the inequality there remains huge and has been reduced only has been reduced moderately, but not as much as people were hoping for when the apartheid ended. So white people still earn 3 times more than Black people. Women earn 29% less than men. These are figures from some of the most unequal countries in the world. And so in such unequal countries, many people have insufficient incomes to cover their basic needs. And it also explains why, although poverty rates have declined a lot in the world, there remains 800 million people or so, which live below a poverty line of $1.90, which is an abysmally low poverty line. So now my last slide about the trends, which I think is what we're looking at in the next global wage report. It's about what the impact of COVID on inequalities. And I think it's fair to say that there's 2 types of impacts here. One is on the effects of the measures that have been taken, and particularly lockdowns and the closure of businesses and of economic activities has exacerbated existing inequalities. And on the other hand, there is an awareness, and there's a growing awareness of the dramatic situation of some groups. So I think there lies also an opportunity, which is what we're going to discuss in the next ILC, the next International Labour Conference next year, to actually strengthen this agenda when we recover from the COVID crisis. So in Europe and the US, the impact has fallen disproportionately on low-income workers and on women. We know that. The ILO has published estimates that working hours have declined massively, 17% in the second quarter of this year compared to the last quarter of last year. And we are going to publish estimates on how these hours have been reduced for men and women, and it's clear that they have reduced more for women than for men. In developing countries, the COVID has has really brought informal economy workers back into the spotlight. The ILO estimates that there are 2 billion people in the world who work in the informal economy. It's huge. It's 60% of total employment, even more in the world. And so we've seen now that, you know, these people, when they lose their jobs or their economic activities, they lose everything. You know, they don't have paid leave. They have no social security. They're not registered, so they cannot stop working. And we've also seen that unless you address some of these issues, it's very hard to deal with the pandemic, because of course there are measures that you simply cannot enforce on the informal economy. So as I say, you know, both a dramatic situation, but maybe also an opportunity for the future if there's growing awareness now of the need to do something. Fernando, do I have already 20 minutes done now? How much more time do I have?
You have the 10 minutes more. Okay.
So I can slow down a bit. So of course, you know, the second half of the presentation here is what can be done. You know, what could we do? There's a lot of things that can be done, and of course, the ILO is only part of the solution, and certainly the labor market is only part of the solution. But certainly a comprehensive effort is necessary here. So first, I think a good news, you know, is that inequality is a growing concern, and we're seeing this at many levels. One level is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. It has many goals which relate to the issue of inequality, different forms of inequality. Goal number 8 is on the promoting of decent work for all men and women. The goal number 5 covers issues related to gender equality. And goal number 10 explicitly covers the issue of inequality and calls for progressively reducing inequality within and between countries through a series of measures which include, or which they have defined as fiscal, wage, and social protection policies. And indeed, you know, these are all important measures. Of course, reducing inequality also will need more than that. It will need measures in the area of skills and education and training and others, but many of the different goals actually are very relevant to this agenda of this inequality reducing agenda. Of course, as I said before, the ILO has been working on this issue of promoting social justice since it was created in 1919. But other organizations like the World Bank and or the OECD, the IMF, also are increasingly promoting shared prosperity for the case of the World Bank, which has a distributional dimension. The OECD is promoting inclusive growth, has had many initiatives, a lot of research on the issue. The latest Human Development Report is on the issue of inequality. So it's not that we are, that we don't have the information. It's that we start to have to act on it. And I think a broad coalition is starting to take shape, but you know, there's many people who still think this is not a relevant agenda and all we need is economic growth and free markets. And as I said before, in building back better after the pandemic, you know, we can learn from countries with positive experiences because there are some. Yeah, Latin America has reduced inequality since the late 90s and in the first decade of this century. So there's a lot of interesting experience there. And countries like Belgium, for example, in Europe has reduced inequality. I think even Portugal, I mean, I might be mistaken. I'm not a specialist of Portugal, but I think Portugal has succeeded in reducing inequalities, at least according to the report that the ILO produced with the ministry a few months ago, and which was a very comprehensive report, which maybe you have seen. So we can learn from these experiences. But the point here is that, and this is my next slide, we need to work on all the different aspects of the distribution. The secondary distribution, we have to work on taxes and transfers. Yes, very important. That's what the IMF is calling for. It's also what the ILO is calling for in terms of extending the coverage of social protection, social security measures. There's a lot of transfers, which, well, there's a lot of people who are not covered by any social security measure. I think more than half of the people. Only 1/3 of people in the world are covered by, comprehensively covered by social security. So definitely it's an important area. Public services is very important because when you have to pay for health and education, it makes it very difficult for low-income households to access these services. And I think much of the unrest in Chile was related also to the cost of education, you know, very important. But let us not forget the primary distribution and the labor market. And so here I want to quote a paper which has just come out in the Journal of Economic Perspectives from Hoffman, Lee, and Lemieux. Labor income, and this is for OECD countries, labor income remains the main driver of inequality over the last 40 years. And it clearly would be difficult to slow down income inequality growth without addressing the inequality in labor income. So we need, you know, we need to, this is the image of the tap. We need to close the inequality tap in the labor markets if we want to comprehensively reduce inequality. So for this, the labor, you know, equitable labor markets will require fair and effective labor market regulations and institutions like minimum wages, like collective bargaining, like equal pay legislation. And I think we can have a discussion on that in a bit more detail. Umberto is going to cover also some of this. Of course, institutions must be designed in a balanced way because there is an argument that if minimum wages are too high, you will reduce employment. And we have to take this seriously. But we need institutions to keep inequality in check in the labor market. Of course, there are also, you know, there are some caveats to what I'm saying here and some challenges. In developing countries, informality is very high. And, you know, we will need to work on formalizing the informal economy because otherwise, institutions will not be applicable. You know, they will simply not be enforced for many people. But in developed countries, you know, I think we need to come out of this thinking that free markets will be the solutions to everything. I think we're not there anymore. I think we all know this. You know, this was maybe in the 1980s, but we have a lot of evidence now that shows that institutions work. And certainly, you know, if I go to minimum wages, which is the area in which I'm specialized, the literature is now showing that minimum wages can work if they're well designed, and they can reduce inequalities, they can reduce gender pay gaps, they can protect workers from vulnerable groups without killing employment if they are well designed. And there is a lot of literature on this now. A lot of research from universities like yours and other universities which have you see this now also in the number of countries which have recently established or strengthened the minimum wages. Germany has adopted the minimum wage. South Africa, we've worked there. Even Qatar, you know, is maybe the first Gulf country, certainly the first country in the Gulf region adopting a comprehensive minimum wage. And we've worked with them, and we think that minimum wages, when they're well designed and carefully balanced, they do make a whole lot of a difference. Now, the ILO Future of Work Declaration, which maybe you know about, Fernando maybe mentioned this in the beginning, is promoting adequate minimum wages, statutory and negotiated. And the European Commission is currently promoting the same thing. And we're engaging in a collaboration with them. And I'm going to present the next global wage report to the European Parliament pretty soon. There is a very important initiative by the European Commission to promote adequate minimum wages in Europe. But this will not be enough. It will cover only basically the bottom of the distribution, the floor. So we also need collective bargaining. You know, we need these institutions. We need also wage setting above the statutory minimum, because otherwise the middle class is not benefiting from economic growth as much as they should. And we even had a seminar not long ago with the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank is wondering, oh, you know, why is inequality increasing so much? Why is economic growth not translating into higher wages for middle class? We're saying, you know, why are you surprised? You know, we've destroyed institutions in many places, in many countries, and now you're asking why people don't benefit. And, you know, I don't want to be critical of the European Central Bank. It's not the point here, but I think we have to spread the message again that institutions make a whole lot of difference. You know, of course, the central bank is more interested in reaching inflation targets, but you have economic growth and you have no wage growth. And this is also because the mechanism to translate economic growth into wage growth is collective bargaining, is negotiating together. It's not unilateral wage setting, because unilateral wage setting leads to more inequality. If you want to have a shared prosperity, you need to have a bargaining. You say, okay, you know, how do we share the increase in the value added? So let me get to my last slide before I'm getting too excited here. So equal pay, you know, non-discrimination, it's absolutely at the heart of the work of the ILO. We have several conventions. The two of them are the Discrimination Convention and the Equal Remuneration Convention. I think I'm going to let Umberto speak more about this. But we're seeing some real progress in some countries. You know, some 2/3 of OECD countries have adopted equal pay or gender equality initiatives. But you know, the interesting difference is between those countries where some of these measures are mandatory, like in Iceland. You know, enterprises have to show that they have equal pay in their enterprises. Otherwise, they get fined, they get sanctioned. In many other places, it's more voluntary, or you have to use a self-assessment. It's very good, you know. But if you don't have equal pay, then well, nothing happens. So there is an expectation that the market will correct itself, which may or may not happen, but certainly one area where there is a lot of additional thinking to be done. And so I'm ending here with a short conclusion, which is reducing inequality is a matter of choice and policy priorities. That's what we're going to discuss in the ILC. You know, in the recent decades, some choices have been made which have increased inequality. This may not have been intended, but it may have been predictable. And actually, this sentence is from our ILO Director General. When we discussed this report with him, he said, "Wow, interesting, you know, but this was all predictable in a way. So we have a choice here. It's not intended, but that's what happened when you implement the kind of policies that we had in the last 20 years. And certainly before the COVID, you know, we had a situation where we had economic growth, but it failed to reduce inequalities and to be as inclusive as it should have been." And so my last bullet point, and I hope I've not exceeded the time, but if I have, then it's Fernando's fault. In building back after the priorities, and if we do agree on the importance of inequality, let's not ignore the role of the labor market. And yes, sure, let's focus on education and all the other aspects of inequality. But you know, do keep labor markets in mind when you do your research, and you know, please do produce more evidence on how institutions affect inequality in the labor market. Phew. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you for sharing this information with us. You have highlighted several important issues that should be addressed to tackle the inequalities at work. And I hope that in the debate, the audience will be able to ask some questions on this important topic. Se calhar agora aproveitava para apresentar o nosso colega Umberto Cattaneo, que é também um perito da OIT, é um economista no âmbito do género, igualdade e diversidade, e no ILO-Chair, que é uma parte integrante do ramo do Departamento das Condições de Trabalho e Igualdade, chamemos-lhe assim, em português. Foi recentemente coautor de 2 relatórios, um deles o relatório do centenário sobre a igualdade de género, intitulado A Quantum Leap for Gender Equality for a Better Future of Work for All, que eu aconselho vivamente a ler, que sublinha os principais gaps e obstáculos que se colocam às mulheres e que condicionam as suas oportunidades no mundo do trabalho. E refiro ainda o outro relatório do qual foi coautora, que é um relatório sobre povos indígenas e que, sobretudo, enfatiza o papel crucial da Convenção 169 sobre povos indígenas e tribais e que apresenta uma abordagem sobre a situação atual e económica, né, vivida por aqueles povos. Seria importante também referir que antes de se juntar à OIT, o nosso colega Umberto trabalhou na área da pobreza feminina no escritório do economista-chefe para a África do Banco Mundial. E no seu percurso académico, Humberto estudou em várias universidades, incluindo a School of Oriental and African Studies, no Reino Unido, a Universidade de Carlos III de Madrid e a Université Libre de Bruxelas, e obteve o seu doutoramento em Economia na Universidade de Génova, em Itália. E, portanto, so now you can proceed. So Umberto, the floor is yours. Thank you. Umberto?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm very sorry I cannot continue in Portuguese. Italian is my mother tongue, and I do understand a bit, but I have not the proficiency to carry out this presentation in Portuguese. So I am delighted to participate. Sorry, apologies. I have a problem with my. I'm delighted to participate in this ILO-Chair at the University of Coimbra, and I think that other introductions are not needed because you gave a very comprehensive introduction. So I'm here today to talk about the care economy, and I would like to start with a definition of the care economy. So I'm going to show you some pictures regarding care work. So here we have a first cluster of pictures where we have, for instance, a father who is picking up kids from school. We have also a father who is cooking with his child, or a woman who is doing the laundry. Here we have another group of pictures where we have primary school teachers, we have a training for domestic workers, and we also have a nurse. So I think that you already can see that these two groups of picture can be actually grouped into separate areas. And these are unpaid care work and paid care work. So the two activities that are carried out within the care economy are unpaid care work and paid care work. And to be actually more precise, unpaid care work can be defined as an activity that is provided without monetary rewards by unpaid carer. It is very important to mention that in 2013, unpaid care work was recognized by the ILO International Conference of Labor Statisticians as work. So it's actually work provided without a monetary reward. And the 2018 Conference of Labor Statisticians has also recognized unpaid care work as a status at work. So in the future, labor force and household surveys will collect information regarding unpaid care work. Why this is important? Well, this is opening the floor for valuing unpaid care work. It's opening the floor maybe to complement the GDP with some estimation of the value of unpaid care work, because it is actually work. So the other branch of work that is in the care economy is paid care work, which is work that is provided, for pay or for profit. And the workers that we find in paid care work are care workers, but also non-care workers. Care workers, just to give you an example, are teachers, nurses, university professors, doctors, and non-care workers are those who are employed in care sectors, but are carrying out a task like administrative tasks, like a secretary working in a university. So care workers and non-care workers are employed in health and social work and education. But we can also find care workers in other sectors, like doctors working for a university or for an international organization. An important other aspect of paid care work are domestic workers. And just to link with the presentation of Patrick, domestic workers are those who often earn the minimum wage, even if their contribution to the economy is very important. Because one point for reflection on domestic worker is that we can maybe discuss afterwards. If I clean my household myself, this is unpaid care work, and it doesn't go into GDP calculation. But if I hire a domestic worker, this becomes something that is valued, something that receives actually remuneration. So these are important considerations I think we can then discuss afterwards. Now let's turn to the COVID-19 crisis. We have seen that with COVID-19 there has been a reduction in care services like school and also elder care, and this has what has brought? This has brought an increase, a sudden increase in demand for unpaid care work for families. And so how families in the world are placed to actually buffer this increase in demand for unpaid care work? Well, we have seen that in the world, 43.5% of the working age population is living in nuclear families. What are nuclear families? Families where we have two parents and one or more daughters or sons. So basically, in these families, when there is an upsurge of unpaid care work, the two parents have to buffer it. And from available data, we see that inequalities in time spent in unpaid care work are basically very persistent, and they are, as Patrick was saying, inequalities are everywhere and also within the household, because as we can see from this chart, the women are bearing the brunt of daily time spent in unpaid care work, because they actually spend 4 hours and 25 minutes of unpaid care work per day compared to just 1 hour and 23 minutes for men. The bad news here in this chart is that this is striking. It's 70.5% of the time spent in unpaid care work is done by women. but also when we look at the total time spent working, women are working longer days than men, and this makes them extremely time poor. But the COVID-19 crisis has not only affected women from the aspect of unpaid care work, but also, as Patrick was saying, from the employment aspect. From the employment side, because women are frequently employed in sectors that the ILO has identified as sectors hard hit by the crisis. Actually, these sectors that are, for instance, accommodation and food services, wholesale and retail trade. Then we have also the real estate and business administrative activities, but also manufacturing sector. In this actually four macro sector, we find 40% of female employment and only 36% of male employment. So the thing is, this risk of job losses and reduction in working hours seems to be higher for women, but this adds to a situation where already women have a penalty in finding employment, because we can see that globally, these data are for 2019, women are 25.7 percentage points less likely to be found in employment than men. These are women of working age, so aged 15 years or above. So this is actually a huge gap. And this is I mean, the COVID crisis is likely to dampen this inequality. And I have actually done a preliminary estimation to see if those who have care responsibility will be more affected by the crisis. There are some preliminary data, labor force surveys data that were available, and this enabled to estimate the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on mothers and fathers' labor force participation rate. And this chart is actually presenting the change in labor force participation rate between 2020 quarter 2 and 2019 quarter 2. It was possible to estimate only for a selected number of countries, but what we can see, it's already interesting. So we can see that, there was a decrease in labor force participation rate between 2020 quarter 2 and 2019 quarter 2, but this decrease was most of the time stronger for women living in couples with children. For instance, if we look at Chile, we have a decrease of 13 percentage points for women living in couples with children, so in a household where there are two partners and one or more children. The other interesting pattern that we can observe is when we plot on the secondary axis. We plot the share of informal employment in total employment. So we can see that the biggest decrease in labor force participation are in countries where there is a high informality rate. This is because labor market institutions, access to income replacement schemes and technical unemployment schemes is more difficult in countries where there is high informality rate, because informal workers have more difficulty in accessing this kind of protection. And while in countries like, for instance, Portugal, where informality rates are quite low compared to global average, around 10%, we still have a decrease, and mothers are those who also suffered more than women without children, but the magnitude of this decrease in labor force participation are actually lower. But the interesting, I mean, we have seen here that mothers face a penalty in terms of accessing the labor force. This was specifically for 5 countries, but we have also estimated this globally, and this is actually consistent across most of the world's countries. But another aspect that we have analyzed is the impact of basically mothers also experience a wage penalty. And the question here was, do mothers face only a labor force participation penalty? And the answer was no. The answer is no, because there is actually a motherhood wage penalty. I'm here presenting this chart that I actually stole from Patrick Global Wage Report 2018 and 2019, which I take usually for my presentation, because it's a great chart that is presenting pay gaps for mothers and fathers. So a positive pay gap means that there is a penalty in terms of earnings associated with motherhood, while a negative pay gap means that there is a premium. So what we can see here, we can see that on average in most of the countries, mothers are experiencing a penalty. So motherhood is associated with a decrease in earning for wage and salaried workers, while fatherhood is associated with a premium, because our estimates are negative here. But we also went a step further. I mean, we also looked at the penalty that mothers are facing when they actually in accessing managerial and leadership positions. And what we have found is that women with children have the lowest chances of being found in a managerial or leadership position. And this is compared to women without children, but also to men with and without children. And so what we can conclude from these 3 slides is that motherhood and the unpaid care work that is coming with this status for women is associated with a triple penalty: in accessing the labor market, in earning like women without children, but also in accessing managerial leadership position, which is also associated to the earnings. Another interesting area that we explored is the reason why women are outside the labor force, because we have seen that there is a gap of 25 percentage points in employment rates for women and men. So we actually have used labor force and household surveys to see what is the main barrier to women's participation in the labor market. And the results are quite striking, because we have found that 41.6% of women who are outside the labor force are so due to unpaid care work. So basically, they cannot find available care services. They cannot find a supply of care services. Therefore, they are actually forced to stay outside the labor force. While the same statistics for men is just 5.8. It means that only 5.8% of men are declared to be outside the labor force due to unpaid care work. So some of the aspects that are common in unpaid care work also are basically translated in paid care work. The first is that the overrepresentation of women, because we can see from this chart that paid care work is a source of employment, a big source of employment for women. For instance, in the world, 19% of female employment is in care work, so it's a huge percentage. And look in the Arab states, more than 50% of employment of female employment is in the care economy, which is a huge amount. But when we look at the health sector, which is very relevant in these days, we can also see that there are in this map 120 countries where the share of women workers among all employed in health and social work is greater than 60%. And in 23 countries, among which Portugal, is greater than 81%. I mean, in Portugal, I will give you the number at 83%. So it's a high participation of women among health and social work. And the fact that we have a big participation of women also in paid care sectors, but what we have seen is that in these sectors there is actually a penalty in terms of pay. I can explain better. So in terms of what? Basically, when we compare the pay of and the wages of care workers with other workers with similar skills and experience, we find a penalty. So the question here is why there is this penalty? Well, the first reason is that there is a lack of recognition of unpaid care work that extends to the under-evaluation of paid care work, because some of the tasks, I mean not all, but some of the tasks that are concerned in unpaid care work can also be performed in paid care work, as I was doing the example before of domestic workers. Then the output is difficult to measure. I mean, this we know it's a public, in many countries, care work is a public good, care services are a public good, so we have a difficulty in pricing and in giving equality, because we know the debate about pricing of public goods. Then migration status, because many care workers are migrant, and there is widespread discrimination across the world towards migrant workers. And another aspect that I'm very glad that was brought brilliantly by Patrick is the low capacity of association and representation and collective agency that is often more preeminent among care workers. So this care pay penalty that we observe among care workers translates in sometimes in poor quality care services, and this also is a disincentive for households to use these care services. And it's important now to see what are these care services. Basically, we have childcare services that in the world have one of the largest coverage gaps. So when we look at the gross enrollment rate of childcare for children aged 0 to 2 years, we have only 18.3% of children enrolled in this education program, which is a very low coverage. When also long-term care services have a very low coverage. Long-term care services are services for those who have a functional need, and we can think about older person care as an example. And across the world, we have estimated that 46% of the population has no access to long-term care services, and 48% has very large deficits. So it's basically non-existent in most of the countries, despite the aging population that is affecting mostly highly industrialized countries, I would say, but also some upper middle income countries. Then other policies that can be used to address the unequal distribution of unpaid care work are care-related social protection transfers and benefits. So when the role of the state is not in the provision of the services, but is more in the provision maybe of vouchers, of other transfers to household to redistribute unpaid care work. Another important policy are leave policies. Leave policies are, for instance, maternity, paternity, parental leave. And I would like to mention that we are actually preparing a new report on this, that is a survey of leave policies and also other care policies, but is particularly focused on leave policies across the world, that we will release in November 2021. And this survey takes actually a picture of all leave policies in the 489 countries. And another labor regulations that can help workers with family responsibility are family-friendly working arrangements that can, in a way, that are now crucial with COVID-19 because telework enabled social distancing. There are some leave, because these leave policies can be more relevant for certain income groups, and there are some care policies that are more relevant for low-income countries, like a care-relevant infrastructure. For instance, piped water in the dwelling, or I mean, electricity can substantially reduce the time that women, for instance, in African countries spend doing unpaid care work. So also this needs to be taken into consideration. We have basically looked at expenditure on leave policies in a selected, on care policies in a selected number of countries. And we have seen that the countries that spend more on care policies have also better outcomes in terms of employment to population ratio for women with care responsibilities. And this is actually good news and calls for an investment in care services and in care policies, as we will see in a moment. Just to give you because I mean, I understand that this was a lot, and this really summarizes all my presentation, and so I would like to spend a minute on this. So unpaid care work, paid work, and paid care work are actually all linked, because if we think about unpaid care work, I mean, the inequality that we have in the distribution of unpaid care work within the household is linked with the participation in paid work, because it's actually hindering women's participation in paid care work. But the level and distribution of unpaid care work are also linked to paid care services, which are provided by paid care workers. Because when paid care workers do not have decent work, do not have the adequate working condition, this actually is putting a pressure on unpaid care work, because household is not willing to use paid care workers, paid care services, because they think they are poor quality, and therefore unpaid care work is supplied within the household. But if we have good working conditions for care workers and decent work, we can also free up some time for the household, and therefore this additional time can be dedicated to leisure, but can also be supplied in the market. And this is the linkage between paid care work and the paid work. And this is very important. The policies regarding the care economies will be needed to achieve the SDGs, because most of the SDGs targets are on the care economy issues. I mean, we have, for instance, SDG 3, SDG 4, SDG 8. Many policies are really linked to the care economy. And the first set of policies that we identified is regards unpaid. So we basically have the 3R formula, which is recognize, reduce, and redistribute work. And we have developed a set of policies for that. As I was saying, care services, early childhood care education, but also we have the importance of adding another R to this triple R framework, the reward, because without decent work for care workers, I mean, unpaid care work cannot be redistributed and reduced. But then also this comes to the other point. To achieve a good reward, we need also representation, social dialogue, and collective bargaining for care workers, because otherwise this will not be possible. And I would add, in light of Patrick's presentation, minimum wages are also very important, in particular for workers. I mean, I think I made an argument for investing in the care economy and showing that it's very important. But sometimes to find the political will for scaling up investments in the care economy, it is necessary to present the results of these models that we developed. So we developed a macroeconomic model that is part of the ILO reports on the care economy, which I will share with all of you, where we produced estimates regarding the number of jobs that can be created if we achieve the sustainable development goals in the care economy. So what we have found is that if the SDGs in the care economy will be achieved, and if the coverage gap, for instance, just to give you an example, the one in child care for children aged 0 to 2, will be filled, there will be a creation of 269 million more jobs in 2030. What does it mean? It means that basically of these 269 million more jobs, 129 million will be tech sectors, but the other 149 million will be in other sectors, thanks to multiplier effects. I mean, this exercise was possible because we used the input-output tables that enabled to estimate the job creation also in other sectors. Achieving such an ambitious target would mean basically more than doubling the share of GDP allocated to tech sectors work from 8.7% in 2015 to 2.3% in 2030. So this actually is a viable option, especially in these times of COVID-19, where health system needs to be strengthened and job creation is actually needed to balance job losses from the COVID-19 crisis. If you want to know more about this model and also about my presentation, I really suggest you to read this report and I will share. Thank you very much.
Pronto, por isso não sei.
Thank you, Umberto. Eu julgo que devo dar a palavra, não é? Professor Hermes, eu pedia só eu pedia aqui à CIT, eu julgo que é a CIT que tem o...
Mais fácil. O que é que o Fernando Júlio...
Deixem-me ver se eu consigo...
É a CIT Azaras.
Que está com...
Ok. E agora?
Obrigado.
Já não está, pois não?
Já não está. Professor Hermes, por favor.
Ok, eu queria só, obviamente, I would like to thank the both presentations of Patrick Belser and Umberto Cattaneo for your magnificent talks. And now we're going to move to a space of debate. And I will explain it in Portuguese. No início da sessão, eu chamei a atenção para o facto de poderem ser formuladas algumas questões, designadamente utilizando o chat e dirigindo as questões de modo privado ao nosso colega, o Fernando Sousa Júnior. Eu penso que ele ainda não terá recebido qualquer questão, eu apenas me foi dirigida uma questão que foi um comentário que eu irei traduzir sobre as questões da desigualdade geracional, mas, portanto, o que eu vos pedi enquanto, e eu, entretanto, formularei uma outra questão ao Umberto e ao Patrick Belser, e enquanto isso, eu pedi a quem quisesse fazer a intervenção que fizesse essa questão por escrito ou que, eventualmente, usasse, numa segunda possibilidade, fizesse o uso do raising hand, do levantar a mão, que eu penso que é possível fazer aí também nos participantes. Embora nós demos preferência a que as questões sejam feitas por escrito, mesmo que seja em português, para o chat privado do Fernando Sousa Júnior, que ele está a recolher essas questões. Enquanto isso não vai ser possível, eu vou levantando a questão que aqui me chegou. So, Patrick and Umberto, we only received one question so far, which is basically it doesn't have a name. It has a number, so I don't know who formulated this question, but however, it is related to Patrick Belser. And it is a question about if you could say something more about the so-called generational inequalities. Since, according to this participant, we have even in the situation of pandemic, we have different kinds of skills, different kinds of I would say evaluations of the reality, depending we are talking about young or old generations. So the issue of generations, if you could explore something more about that. But this is only one question. I would like to, Fernando is raising the hand. Do you want to say something, Fernando?
Yes, I have two questions, one for each of our speakers. The first one, I presume, is to Patrick. It's how do you think the social elevator, the mobility in the developed countries can reduce the inequalities at work? If so, how it is possible to achieve decent work. And to Umberto, I have one question. Is the increase of care economy, is the increase of care economy a reflection of the aging population in developed countries? São estas as questões que eu tinha.
Okay. So
Okay.
This means that this means that we have so far, I believe, 3 questions. If you permit me, I could add 1 or more 2 questions, and then we're going to you have time to respond, and we're going to move to a second round of questions. So, but I just would like to add 1 question to, I would say, to both of you, but initially to Patrick Belser, is this this meaning of fairness, or this meaning of sense of justice. How do you face this? Because you have talked about this idea of social of inequalities, and but anyway, what do you think in times of pandemic? What are the newcomers of social inequalities? Of course, you say you have heard that the inequalities didn't start today; they just came from the past. But anyway, I would say new social groups, new social, I would say, targets of the inequalities. How would you consider this? And this sense of fairness, this sense of justice, how is it possible to reach this kind of sense of justice? Because, of course, we can also talk about, when you talk about labor and the world of work, we can think about, I would say, global resource. But anyway, it's not possible, it's not easier to talk about a global labor market, in the sense that we have a pattern of organization of labor and so on. So how do we deal with this kind of apparent contradiction between the sense of social justice and fairness on one hand, but on the other hand, on the difficulty to raise a global labor market to deal with this kind of issue? And so if you could say something about it, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me perhaps start with the first question, which is about issues related to generations. It's you know, the type of studies that we have done in the ILO, at least that I'm familiar with, and that we have commissioned and that we have published, have a lot to do with pay gaps between young people and people less than 25 years old, and people above 25 years old, and also how do we look at these pay gap, because youth is only a transitional phase. You know, me too. One day I was young. I'm not young anymore, and so you have people saying, well, you know, the fact that young people earn less than other people isn't really a big problem, because one day they'll have more experience, they'll earn more. But of course, okay, we can take that as something which nature has put on us. But this being said, what we've observed is that in times of crisis, very often the pay gaps or the pay penalty of young people increases, and so you see that particularly that when young people enter the labor market in a period of crisis, they risk, and I hate saying that to students, if there are students in this group, I think there are many, but you know, I think you have to manage your career, if you can, in a way that you don't end up with a permanent penalty for having entered the labor market in a bad moment. And that's what we call the scarring effect. And I'm sure Hermes, you've been looking at this type of research in your university too, is that if young people undersell themselves basically in time of crisis, you know, don't get stuck in these jobs. Easier said than done, but it's a real risk. And I think you know, this is something that we're facing now as well. How do you enter a labor market in a time of COVID, where hiring practices or basically hirings have been frozen in many enterprises, and certainly so that's a big generational issue that we're going to face, we're facing, and we're going to face. We have a whole department working on also youth employment programs, and they would be better placed than I am to present their work. But it's certainly something which the ILO is taking very, very seriously, and we have a whole program which has also published a lot of interesting materials which you can download from the internet. On the social elevator, I would say that inequality and social mobility are very closely interrelated. And in fact, when you have a lot of inequality of outcomes, or you might call them, of situations, you tend to have less social mobility. And in fact, there's some very interesting research. There's some very interesting research on this, sometimes called I can't remember why, but it's called the Great Gatsby curve. Because it basically shows that in countries where there is a lot of inequality, there is less social mobility. And so paradoxically, you have in the US, where people strongly believe in that equality of opportunity is what matters, and social mobility is what matters, and not so much the outcomes, the existing inequality, that everybody has a chance to get on top. Well, you have less of a chance to get on top if you come from a poor background. So somebody actually, I think it was the Prime Minister of Sweden, said, or someone said, if you want to live the American dream, you have to go to Scandinavia. And so yes, of course, that's the key thing, is that reducing inequality is also what promotes social mobility, and social mobility is. I think is the lifeline of societies. I think there is one exception, which is well, not an exception, but you have a situation in France where you have relatively low inequality of outcomes. So it seems like, I mean, it's a very equitable country in some sense, but you have low social mobility. So it does exist. It does not necessarily, one goes with the other, but certainly they tend to be correlated when you look at a group of countries. And then, Hermes, your question about fairness and sense of justice. I don't know, it's a difficult question. I'm just thinking that, in the period of the COVID, we've all had a chance to appreciate the importance of socially useful work. And, we've been in Switzerland, we've been clapping our low-paid staff in the hospitals every evening at 7 o'clock. We've realized how important it is to have people in supermarkets who the cashiers and the people who are doing work at their jobs, because they were essential activities, whereas we've been sitting at home doing our telework. And hopefully, this is creating a sense of increasing the sense of fairness and solidarity and recognitions for some groups of people maybe collectively we have not been so appreciative of. I'm not sure it responds to your question, but your question is a difficult one. But it's something that springs to my mind. So I'll stop there, and maybe Umberto, maybe he can also address the Hermes question.
Thank you, Patrick, for giving me the floor on this difficult question. But I will start from the question on the care economy. Regarding the increase in unpaid care work due to aging population, I mean, for sure, aging population in particular in Europe is one of the reasons why unpaid care work burden has increased, because there is an increasing number in people in need of care, and we have estimated that in the world there would be an increase of 100 million persons in need of care now and 2030. So it's a huge number of people, and the definition of older persons we use is those aged 5 years above the healthy life expectancy. So it's really those who we are almost sure will need some type of care, and the picture is not so it's not so good, because there are gaps in long-term care coverage, because in certain countries long-term care can be provided in institutions, in other there are vouchers, but in other is actually provided within the household. And it can be, I mean, I'm sure that among the audience there is someone who had the experience of caring for an older relative, and this can be very rewarding, because it's also maybe a person that we like to spend time with, but it can also be very burdensome in terms of the activities that then the person who is taking care needs to do. And there are actually some initiative that we have seen across the world, that the time that a person spends caring for an older person can be then credited towards pension. And this is something that it's worth mentioning, because it's a practice that was used in Chile when there was Michelle Bachelet. It is also used in Finland, because it's very important to credit this time, because I mean it's a full-time job, and it's something that if will be done in the private sector, or it will be both in the market, not. Then going to the second question on fairness and sense of justice, I'm so glad that Patrick brought up the essential workers. My reflection on that would be that among essential workers we have care workers, and what I've shown is that care workers are facing a penalty in terms of pay, but they are low paid, and if we think about their situation now, they are also risking of getting the virus, and this risk is not compensated with other pay, but they are continuing to get this penalty in terms of earnings that I've shown, and the risk is not compensated in terms of any increase in pay. I mean, there has been some initiatives, for those who are working with COVID-19 patients in hospitals, but it's not only those working in hospitals, it's all people working with the public that are now risking of contracting the COVID-19 virus. Thanks.
Okay.
We have several questions, so we are trying to deal with them. But maybe I could start with an observation. Came from Maria. She said that someone who works in Qatar informed her there is no minimum wage for Indians, Sri Lanka workers, and Pakistanis, obviously the natives from Qatar. Can you tell us something about this? And from Diogo, I think, how do you see the role of the state in the attempt to reduce COVID-19 impact in the inequality and incommensurable in the countries? Sorry, I'm trying to, well, let me see, okay. once again, okay, this question is from Diogo, and he asks your opinion about the role that ILO and the states can play in the attempt to reduce COVID-19 impacts in the inequality of income in those countries, in the different countries. And let me see if I have another one. I suppose there's another question from Eduardo that is related, sorry. How can ILO implement the standard minimum wage to trying to address the decent work if there are very different realities at national level? So I'm not sure if I could translate and put the questions how they should, but how can ILO implement the minimum wage if there are different levels, very differences between the national levels, and so okay.
So maybe I can start with Qatar. You know, we've worked with Qatar. I've been in Qatar myself several times. I'm sending you a link in the Zoom group chat.
Patrick, you are on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. I will start with the one on Qatar. We've worked with Qatar. I've been to Qatar myself several times. Qatar, I've just put in the Zoom group chat the press release from the ILO about the adoption of the minimum wage in Qatar. It didn't exist so far. I'm not sure exactly when it comes into force, if it has started or not, but it was announced in August this year that there would be a minimum wage for workers from all nationalities, and also workers, including domestic workers, including Indian workers, including Pakistani workers, including workers from anywhere, and which will be set at a particular level if accommodation and food is not provided by the employer, if accommodation food is provided by the employer. If that's not the case, it will be set at a higher level. And so I've just put it in the chat, so you can click on it. You will see it's the first country in the Gulf which is doing this. We have a special relationship with Qatar and the ILO because we have a big program of collaboration with Qatar, which was more or less started when the country also was awarded the World Cup. And so it's a country which is really undergoing a series of important reforms at the moment. Let's see what happens in a few years. But the major change there is also the abolition of the system called the kafala system, which is basically a sponsorship system where the immigration status of a person was related to the employment status of a person. And so you needed to have a sponsor which could basically prevent you from leaving the country if that employer was not happy with you. Now this migration and employment status has been separated out. So, you know, do go on the website of our Qatar office. It's very interesting what's going on in the country. The second question is, how can you address minimum wage in different countries? Well, we have a convention. That convention recognizes that that countries are in very different situations. And so it calls for a series of principles, which is have a minimum wage setting institution in the country with workers, employers, and also academics being represented, taking into account setting a level that takes into account the needs of workers and their families and economic factors, have regular adjustments, and also have mechanisms to ensure the adequate enforcement of the minimum wage. And so it's clear that it's also the initiative at the level of the European Commission is not promoting one same minimum wage rate in different countries, but it's promoting a form of harmonized level across countries as a percentage of the median wage. So I think what the Commission is proposing, okay, is to have minimum wages in all the countries of the European Union set at 60% of the median wage in the country. So the median wage is the wage of the person in the middle of the distribution, as you know. It tends to be lower than the average wage because the average is skewed by the fact that some people have very high wages. But the median, the person in the middle, and 60% of that, and that can be a reference point for the minimum wage. Now, even in the level of the European Union, there's big debates because some countries don't want that. And this includes the countries which rely on systems of collective bargaining. And they think that the minimum wage, a statutory minimum wage, would be the wrong thing, that it's better to have collectively bargained minimum wage. And collectively bargained means only between workers and employers with no state intervention. And so it's a big debate and big controversy. And of course, workers support it very much. The International Trade Union Confederation supports the initiative. Employers' organizations are less enthusiastic about it, as you can imagine. Same is true in the ILO when there's discussions on minimum wages, but generally, employers' organizations in many countries are supportive of the principle, but want to have more flexibility in terms of deciding the level within the country. I think there was one more question on inequality, but maybe I can leave it for Umberto.
Okay. Okay, sure. So the question was, how do you see the role of the state in the attempt to reduce the COVID-19 impact? So myself as well, I would like to reply by giving you, first of all, a link. So, I mean, social protection colleagues would be maybe better placed to reply to this question, but I will try my best. So there has been an upsurge of measures from governments to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And at this link that I'm sharing in the group chat box, you can find the website of social protection where some of these measures are mentioned. But an update of the data on October 28 has shown that they found that in 208 countries between February 1st and October 28, 2020, there has been 1,518 social protection measures. So a lot of measures to fight COVID-19 related to old age, remuneration, like vouchers for paying for babysitter, childminders, access to health service. I mean, several different measures. The difference between the COVID-19 crisis and the global recession of 2008 is that the position was not austerity, luckily, I would add. The ILO Director General has actually called for non-austerity at the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. And this call was directed towards the World Bank and the IMF, which during the global recession were among those who were actually saying that it was better to have austerity measures, which then didn't turn out to be mostly effective in some of the countries. But I mean, now we have this trend, which is kind of positive. States are, the role of the state is more prominent, and it's also went in some areas that, like unpaid care work, that was actually unthinkable before. So it's actually good news, and there are the grounds for building back better and for having a post-COVID-19 future which is more inclusive and lays the ground for reducing inequalities. But given the political component of this question and given the seniority of Patrick, I mean, I think that he can add some words on that. Thanks.
No, look, I think that was very good, Umberto. I think it is true that the ILO has highlighted the amazing number of measures that have been taken during the COVID crisis, particularly on extension of social protection. And so one call now is to say, okay, maybe some of these measures that we're taking as exceptional measures can be used as a basis for more sustainable long-term policies. So don't deconstruct everything you have constructed. Keep the good things and build on what has been constructed. You have shown that it is actually possible to extend the protection of social security measures to many more people than we thought, and so let's build on that. Of course, some programs will unwind. Wage subsidies, for example, is a big component of state intervention in the period of crisis. That is, billions of dollars are being spent by the state to pay for the wages of enterprises. And that's very good. That, of course, cannot continue forever. But, extending social security in terms of health and unemployment benefits, this is feasible. So a very good question, and I think let's see what's going to happen. You have the pessimist group and the optimistic group, but ultimately it depends on the citizens of the countries as well.
Well, I have two more questions, if you don't mind. One is from Achilles. He asks if there are any policies or public politics in any government to assist non-remunerated people to care of their relatives with home care needs, not only the old people, but anyone who needs care, is one question. The other one is from my colleague Albertina. Care work has a strong gender mark. The majority care work is performed by women, but not all is poorly paid, for instance, doctors. But thinking of nurses, apparently we can find also the gender mark. Umberto, could you please elaborate more on this gender gap and the impact in the future of work for women, please? I'm not sure if you got, okay.
Yes. More questions or?
So far is what okay. We have. I have to check if there are any more. Okay.
Okay. So if there are governments that, yes, I mean there are governments that provides long-term care services for people with needs. And this is not only directed towards older persons, but is directed also towards persons with disability or person with long-term sickness. And actually, this is what I was explaining before, that long-term care, it's a term that we use that is usually is not, I mean, is not associated only to older persons, it's associated with all persons with a functional dependency, but it's true that sometimes, given that the older person carries the largest share and where it comes the largest demand, one can assume that it's only older person care, but this is actually not the case. And regarding the countries, we have some services in the forms of vouchers, but the share of recipients is very low. The problem with these services is that maybe there are some schemes, but they are all means tested based on the income and also on the asset of the household that is demanding these services. And sometimes these schemes are not really reaching those in need, because the amount of resources that are needed to care for someone with a long-term care need are sometimes very high. And since there is not the willingness to make it more universal, these schemes are often means tested, and it's not easy to access them. Regarding the second questions, yeah, the majority of care work is performed by women, and yeah, I think that, I mean, the question was about how can this have an implication for a future closure of gender gaps in the labor market. I mean, we can for sure think about the distribution of unpaid care work as one of the best solutions for closing the gender gaps in the labor market, because unpaid care work is the main reason why women are outside the labor force. Therefore, something that we need to do is really to redistribute this. And this finding was also confirmed by an ILO Gallup study, where we ask women and men what is the biggest challenge for women in the labor market, so those who are employed. And work-family balance was at the top for women, was the main challenge. And the second one was lack of affordable childcare. So really, to close the gender gaps, I think that more investments are needed in the care economy, which will mean also more care jobs. And it's very important to talk about investments when we talk about the care economy, because salaries of care workers sometimes, I mean not sometimes, in the accountancy of governments are seen as a current expenditure. Therefore, in time of crisis, current expenditure are cut to reduce budget deficits. But instead, these salaries can actually increase capabilities of people and well-being of society and reduce the gender gaps in the labor market. Therefore, we should talk about investments also when we talk about salaries of care workers. Thanks.
Okay. I believe, Fernando, we don't have more questions. Basically, as we've seen, we had 30 minutes for each presentation and at least 30 minutes or 35 minutes for debate, which seems to be enough. But anyway, I would like to say, if anyone, the last question, the last offer for the debate, if someone wants to make a question without being done a privileged inscription or written question, you can do it right now. If someone wants just one question to summarize, to finalize to finish the debate, if there is no question, we can finish now. Anyone wants to ask? Because I'm seeing in the audience we had a lot of a very broad audience, not only of academics, professors, and students of all different cycles of studies, but also people from public institutions in Portugal, from the Ministry of Labor, from the Authority on Working Conditions, from the Portuguese Parliament. We have people around this debate. If someone wants to raise a final question,
I suppose there is one, Manuel Abrantes.
Okay, we can stay with Manuel as the last question, okay? Manuel.
I would thank you very much for the presentations. I would like to ask Mr. Umberto Cattaneo a question. I realize that there have been changes in paid domestic work. I mean, changes in dynamics of the sector and in the regulation of the sector in various countries, often following the ILO convention. So I would just like to ask you if there is any country or any countries that you consider good examples concerning policies specifically on paid domestic work. Thank you very much.
Shall we collect our other question, or shall I answer?
It's the last one, Umberto.
Okay.
You have
so,
to jump into the swimming pool.
Yes, I mean, Convention 189 was a landmark convention for working conditions of domestic workers. And I mean, regarding specific countries, there are some examples regarding formalization of domestic workers. For instance, there are some agencies that specialize in formalization of domestic workers, and we can find some example in Belgium or in France. But this was a positive trend, because I mean, domestic workers with this agency, they get paid. But on the other hand, there are also stories of domestic workers that need to pay to affiliate to these agencies for making courses. So it's really difficult then how what is the best way forward, because the agencies on a way they simplify the payment of social protection contribution, which is one of the reasons why employer often they don't regularize domestic workers, because not only it's more expensive, but it's also difficult. I mean, but with these agencies, there was a simplification of this social protection benefits payment that was seen as beneficial. But on the other hand, there are also cases, as I was saying, of domestic workers reporting that they need to pay to affiliate for courses, and this is not actually good. So, I mean, I think that these two cases of France and Belgium can answer your question.
It seems there is another question from Mafalda Araújo. Is the last one, okay. Once we have established the informal unpaid care work is working, how can we deal with the dilemma from the wanting to support if through social protection transfers, while not stimulating its gendered divisions of informally insourced labor, nor running the risk of turning it into a form of underpaid work? Okay, I'm not sure when. Okay, let me check this. I read it again. Once we have established that informal unpaid care work is work, how can we deal with the dilemma derived from wanting to support it through social protection transfers, while not stimulating its gendered divisions of informally insourced labor, nor running the risk of turning it into a form of underpaid work? This question is from Mafalda Araújo.
Yes, I think I understood more or less, and I think that the question was, yeah. So if we recognize unpaid care work and then this unpaid care work is actually redistributed with social protection transfer. So we transfer from the state to households that then can purchase services from domestic workers. How can this not actually perpetrate low pay for domestic workers? Because if the transfer probably are not adequate, then the domestic worker will continue to be low paid. I mean, one way would be to have a minimum wage policy, because if there is a minimum wage, you cannot pay the domestic worker below this minimum wage, or have adequate transfer to match the minimum wage. Because I mean, if social transfer are not enough, it's sure that they can have a perverse effect in actually helping household, because household can use the transfer to underpay domestic workers. But I'm sure that there are mechanisms to avoid this type of this type of externality. We can. I mean, the technicality can be that the transfer can go directly to the domestic workers, but there are also social transfer are one aspect, but the other aspect is also public investment in care services, which can promote better gender equality at work. Because one aspect which is also related to the other question that we had was that the domestic work, when we look at the share of domestic workers in total employment, we have a higher share of domestic worker, the more inequality there is in the country. So we actually plot Gini coefficient with the share of domestic worker in the economy, and when there is high inequality, there is a high share of domestic worker, which means that only few households can afford the services of a domestic worker. This is the case in many Latin American countries. Therefore, social transfer can be a transition policy, but then there needs to be structural investments in care services. I mean, I'm not sure if Patrick would like to add something on minimum wages.
Maybe just a very short word to say that it's true that after the adoption of the convention, we saw quite a number of changes to bring domestic workers under the protection of minimum wage legislation, of the minimum wage policy, I should say, because it's true that if domestic workers are not recognized as workers, then the minimum wage would not necessarily apply to them. And very often their working conditions are regulated by different laws and not necessarily the labor code, which sometimes only applies to people who are employed in enterprises, basically. And here, because the domestic worker is employed by another individual, by a household, then in some places the minimum wage doesn't automatically apply. And we've seen quite a number of countries which have brought domestic workers under the protection of minimum wages. Including many states in India, including in the US, provinces in India, and for example, also in Chile, there was an effort to raise the level of the minimum wage of domestic workers up to the general level of the minimum wage. Because sometimes you have a minimum wage rate for everybody and a lower rate for domestic workers. And so why is that the case? How is that justifiable? And so Chile, over 3 years, they gradually increased the rate of domestic workers up to getting them into the general rate. And in fact, something similar is happening in South Africa. And so these are more examples of emerging countries, but very important, as Umberto mentioned. So I'll stop there. Hermes, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. It was a magnificent afternoon. We spent here more than 2 hours with the debate, with the presentations, and with the debate. I would like to thank all of you, of course, especially to the speakers, especially to Patrick and Umberto, and to all the audience that was been here, and of course to Fernando and the colleagues from the ILO Lisbon, we'll keep on this debate. And of course, our speakers today are available, of course, in the future to respond to additional comments, to additional suggestions based on their work. Of course, they are not supposed to be answering to everybody at any time, but they will be available to debate with you in another situation. Because, as you know, many of you probably would like to ask something but didn't feel so comfortable to raise a question. So, but this debate keeps on going. And of course, this was only the third edition of the ILO-Chair of the Cátedra OIT, but we expect that we'll keep on this cooperation in the future. And we are basically right now, we're going to start to prepare the next one for the next year. And of course, as I've said in the beginning, we are trying to plan some outputs as a result of this cooperation between the University of Coimbra, the Faculty of Economics, and the Center for Social Studies in a certain way, and of course the ILO. And I think this cooperation will be strength for the future. And I would like to thank to all of you once again, for this cooperation. After the break, of course, after the finishing, we're going to have a very small meeting of Patrick and I and Umberto with you, just to finish a conversation among us, okay? But to all the others, once again, thank you very much for all, not only from those from the University of Coimbra, but of course from all of you that spend your time to join with us to listen and to learn all this knowledge from Patrick and from Umberto. Thank you very much to all of you, and bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.